The courtroom was dead silent. The jury, the judge, even the arrogant Sergeant Ryan Wilkins sat frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like an avalanche. Danielle Carter, clad in a navy blue blazer that barely concealed the sheer force of her presence, took a slow step toward the stand. Her voice, smooth but carrying the authority of a battlefield commander, cut through the tension like a blade. "You said I was aggressive," she stated, eyes locked on Wilkins. "You said I tried to grab your gun." Wilkins smirked, but it was weaker now. "That's exactly what happened." Danielle nodded, her movements deliberate. "Tell me, Sergeant, in your 15 years on the force, have you ever gone hand-to-hand with an actual combat veteran? Have you ever tried to take down a SEAL?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Wilkins' smirk faltered. Danielle took another step forward, her presence swallowing the space between them. "Because if I had actually tried to take your weapon, you wouldn't be sitting here lying about it. You'd be in a hospital." Gasps erupted from the jury. The judge raised an eyebrow. The tension was unbearable. Marcus, her attorney, let the silence hang before pressing forward. "Your Honor, the defense submits Exhibit D, footage from the security camera that Sergeant Wilkins conveniently forgot to mention." A monitor flickered on. Grainy footage from a nearby storefront played, and the room collectively leaned in. Wilkins standing over Danielle, shoving her against the hood of the car. She wasn't resisting. She wasn't moving at all. And then, clear as day, his voice rang out in a cruel sneer. "Women like you don't get to question me." The entire courtroom erupted. Wilkins' face drained of color. His lawyer paled. The jury exchanged shocked glances. The weight of his words, his lie, crashed down on him like a tidal wave. Danielle, standing tall and unshaken, simply folded her arms. "The only person who was out of control that night," she said, "was you." Before we dive into what happens next, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you love stories about justice and truth, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs, the tension thick enough to choke the air. The wooden benches in the gallery were packed with spectators, some curious, some whispering, and others already forming their own silent judgments. Reporters clutched notepads and adjusted their microphones, waiting for the inevitable spectacle to unfold. At the back, a row of uniformed officers sat stiffly, their expressions unreadable, but their presence alone sent a clear message. They were there to support their own. The judge's bench loomed at the front of the room, and beneath its shadow sat the defendant, Danielle Carter. Danielle, a 35-year-old black woman, sat with an air of quiet control, her back straight, her shoulders squared. She wasn't rattled, she wasn't afraid. If anything, she was watching, studying the room like a battlefield strategist, assessing every possible move before the first shot was fired. Her dark brown eyes swept across the jury, searching for cracks in their resolve, for any sign that they were willing to listen, not just hear. Her face remained impassive, a mask of calm, but beneath the surface her muscles were taut, her breathing measured. The discipline of a lifetime in the military had not left her. She had endured worse than this. And yet, the reality of what was happening pressed against her chest like an iron weight. Across the room, Sergeant Ryan Wilkins sat at the plaintiff's table, his body language oozing arrogance. A white man in his early 40s, he wore his uniform like a shield, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, as if it alone granted him untouchable authority. His jaw was sharp, his blonde hair neatly trimmed, but it was the smirk on his face that set the tone, a look of assured victory. He had seen cases like this before, and he knew how they ended. The court believed officers, always. His voice carried through the room as he recounted his version of events, his tone filled with just the right amount of conviction, just the right balance of concern and authority. He described Danielle as aggressive, uncooperative, a dangerous woman who had tried to take his weapon. He leaned slightly forward as he spoke, scanning the jury with calculated ease, feeding them the story he knew they wanted to believe. He had played this role before, the good cop who had been forced to take action. And as he spoke, the tension in the room shifted, his words planting seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had yet to decide where the truth lay. Wilkins adjusted his posture slightly, his voice steady, dripping with authority as he addressed the jury. He described how, on the night in question, he had been patrolling a quiet strip in downtown Atlanta when he noticed Danielle Carter loitering outside a closed hardware store. According to him, she was standing too close to the entrance, her movements suspicious, her presence unnecessary at that hour. His tone was smooth, practiced, as he painted a picture of a tense situation, one where he, the dutiful officer, had merely been following protocol. He stated that when he approached her and asked for identification, she immediately became aggressive, refusing to comply, raising her voice. He claimed that as he tried to de-escalate the situation, she took a sudden step toward him, her hand jerking toward his holster. A flicker of faux concern crossed his face as he described how he had no choice but to restrain her for his own safety. It was the kind of story the jury had heard before, the kind of testimony that normally ended in a swift conviction. Several jurors nodded along, absorbing his words, their expressions shifting into mild discomfort, as if they were already picturing the scene he described. A few leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, listening intently, their faces unreadable. Others, however, shifted in their seats, some stealing quick glances toward Danielle, as if trying to gauge whether the woman in front of them could truly be the violent criminal Wilkins was painting her to be. The judge, Henry Lawson, sat back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Danielle, his face unreadable, but his silence heavy. His fingers tapped absently on the bench, his posture relaxed, but his eyes keen, watching her for any sign of emotion. Danielle remained still, her face impassive, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't flinch at Wilkins' words, didn't react to the murmurs from the jury or the glances thrown in her direction. She had faced worse enemies in her life, and she wasn't about to let a man like Wilkins shake her now. Across the room, Wilkins cast her a smug glance, his lips curling at the edges, his confidence unwavering. He believed he had already won. He had told his story, had laid out his case in a way that left little room for doubt. The court believed officers. That's how the system worked. All he had to do now was sit back and let the wheels of justice turn in his favor. Wilkins leaned forward slightly, adjusting his uniform as if to emphasize his authority, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. He described Danielle with chilling precision, his words laced with the undertones of someone who had already made up his mind long before this trial had begun. He told the jury how, from the moment he approached her that night, he knew something was off. She wasn't just some woman out late. She was tense, calculating, her movements too controlled, her eyes filled with something he could only describe as dangerous. She had the eyes of someone ready to attack, he said, pausing just enough to let the weight of his words sink in. His gaze swept the room, making sure every juror absorbed the image he was painting. I've been on the force for over 15 years, and I know when someone is preparing to fight. I could see it in her stance, the way her shoulders squared up when I asked for ID, the way she stared at me like she was sizing me up. I didn't have a choice. I had to act fast before things escalated. He exhaled deeply, shaking his head slightly, as if the memory still unsettled him. I tried to de-escalate, he continued, his tone shifting into something almost regretful. I told her I just needed to see her ID, that it was routine, but she refused. She got hostile, and before I knew it, she was reaching for my holster. I had to restrain her. I had to think about my safety and the safety of the community. Prosecutor David Mills, sitting at his table, allowed a slow, satisfied grin to spread across his face. He could already feel the momentum of the case tilting in their favor. He had seen it happen time and time again. The moment an officer testified about feeling threatened, about having no choice, it was usually the beginning of the end for the defense. This case, he thought, would be no different. The jury sat in rapt silence, absorbing Wilkins' words, a few of them exchanging quick glances as if processing the implications. A woman in the front row, a middle-aged teacher with reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose, furrowed her brow slightly but didn't object. An older man, likely ex-military, nodded faintly, as if the officer's words resonated with him. The weight of Wilkins' testimony hung in the air, pressing down on the courtroom like a slow-building storm. From her seat, Danielle remained motionless, her expression unreadable, but her fingers curled slightly against her lap. She had been trained to withstand pressure, trained to face enemies who sought to control the narrative before the battle even began. But this, she knew, was no battlefield. It was something worse. Here, truth was not enough. Here, perception was the weapon, and right now Wilkins was wielding it flawlessly. Mills stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate slowness as he approached the witness stand, his confidence growing with every step. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call Mr. James Miller to the stand," he announced, his voice smooth and authoritative. The bailiff nodded and opened the side door, allowing a frail-looking elderly man to shuffle into the courtroom. James Miller, well into his 70s, had the look of someone who had lived in the same neighborhood for decades, watching it change in ways he didn't approve of. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, but the moment he took his seat and faced the courtroom, his expression hardened with certainty. Mills smiled warmly, playing to the jury as much as to the witness. "Mr. Miller, can you please tell the court what you saw on the night in question?" Miller cleared his throat, leaning slightly forward, his aged voice steady despite the slight rasp. "I was sitting on my porch like I always do in the evenings. It was late, quiet, just the way I like it. Then I saw her." He tilted his head slightly toward Danielle, not bothering to mask the suspicion in his tone. She was standing outside the hardware store looking around like she was checking if someone was watching. She wasn't shopping, wasn't waiting for anyone, just standing there, and I thought to myself, that's not right, that's not normal. Danielle didn't move, didn't react, but she felt the weight of his words settle on her like a familiar burden. Mills nodded as if Miller's statement was pure fact. "And in your opinion, what about her behavior seemed off?" Miller pursed his lips, his fingers curling around the wooden edge of the witness stand. "She looked like she was up to no good," he said simply. "You know how they are." A ripple went through the room. The words were spoken so casually, so easily, as if he had merely stated a fact, not a deep-seated bias that had just bled into the air for all to hear. The silence was heavy, stretching across the courtroom like an invisible line between those who agreed and those who suddenly found themselves shifting in discomfort. The jury reacted in varied ways. One of the younger jurors, a black woman in her 30s, stiffened, her jaw tightening as she turned her gaze toward Miller with slow, deliberate scrutiny. Another juror, a white man in his 50s, simply nodded, as if what Miller had said was something he understood all too well. A few jurors exchanged hesitant glances, their expressions conflicted. The judge exhaled quietly through his nose, rubbing the bridge of his forehead but saying nothing. Mills, undeterred, pressed forward. "So, to clarify, you believe that Miss Carter's mere presence outside a closed business was suspicious?" Miller nodded sharply. "I know trouble when I see it." Danielle inhaled slowly through her nose. The restraint it took to keep her face unreadable was the same discipline that had kept her alive in war zones where hesitation meant death. This was no different. Across the room, Wilkins sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his smirk returning. He could feel the slow shift in the room, the old familiar rhythm of racial bias working in his favor. This was the part of the system that didn't need evidence, that didn't need proof. It only needed a whisper of doubt, an aging witness with enough certainty in his prejudice to make the jury lean his way. Miller adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Danielle for the first time. "I'm not saying she did anything, but I know the type, and she fits it." Danielle's attorney, Marcus, had been silent up until now, his fingers white-knuckled around the pen in his hand. He was young, inexperienced, but even he knew what was happening. He could feel the momentum slipping, the invisible weight of unspoken assumptions settling in. He could hear the verdict being written in the silence that followed Miller's words. He forced himself to stand, clearing his throat, trying to ignore the way his palms were already damp. "Mr. Miller, do you personally know Ms. Carter?" Miller frowned. "No." "Had you ever seen her before that night?" "No." Marcus nodded, his voice growing sharper. "Then tell me, Mr. Miller, what exactly made you think she was up to no good? Was she breaking into the store? Was she holding anything suspicious? Was she behaving erratically?" Miller shifted slightly. "I already told you she was standing there, looking around. That's how it starts." That's how what starts? You know, Miller said, his voice dropping slightly. A collective inhale rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the jurors who had nodded before now looked hesitant, uncertain. Marcus took a slow step forward, his voice softer now, dangerously precise. Sir, if my client had been a white woman in a business suit, would you have thought the same thing? Miller stiffened, his eyes narrowing. That's not the same. Why not? Miller's mouth opened, then closed. He frowned, his face tightening with frustration. Marcus let the silence stretch. Let the weight of the question settle over the jury, over the entire courtroom. Danielle could see the battle happening now, the unspoken questions forming in the minds of those watching. It was a small shift, but it was there. Miller huffed, crossing his arms. I don't like what you're trying to do, young man. Marcus's lips barely twitched. I'm just asking questions, Mr. Miller. You said you know trouble when you see it. I'm just trying to understand exactly what you saw. Miller clenched his jaw, his confidence faltering. He looked toward Mills for help, but the prosecutor remained still, his fingers laced together on the table, as if realizing that pushing any further would only make things worse. For the first time, Wilkins' smirk faded slightly. Marcus took a step back, his hands relaxed at his sides now. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Lawson exhaled heavily, his gaze shifting toward the jury as if measuring their reactions. All right, the witness may step down. Miller climbed down from the stand with jerky movements, muttering under his breath. The courtroom remained silent, but the energy had changed. The seed of doubt had been planted, and for the first time Wilkins could feel it creeping through the cracks. He didn't like it. Marcus let the silence settle over the courtroom like a slow-building storm, his question still hanging in the air. James Miller shifted in his seat, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand as his jaw tensed. He opened his mouth, closed it, then frowned, clearly thrown off balance. His earlier confidence wavered as he glanced toward Mills, as if looking for help, but none came. The prosecutor sat still, his expression carefully neutral, unwilling to interfere in a moment that was quickly unraveling. Miller started, but the words didn't come out as easily as before. He cleared his throat, his fingers adjusting the thin wire of his glasses, buying himself time. That's not the same thing, he finally said, voice quieter now. Marcus took a slow step forward, tilting his head slightly, his expression sharp but calm. Not the same how, sir? Miller huffed, shifting again, his gaze darting toward the jury. Some of them were watching him intently now, their previous nods of agreement replaced with something more uncertain, more hesitant. A younger juror in the front row, a black woman in her early 30s, had her arms crossed tightly, her lips pressed together as she studied him. Another juror, a middle-aged white man, sat back slightly, his expression unreadable but tense. I just mean, you have to trust your instincts, Miller finally muttered. You see things, you know things. I know when something don't feel right. Marcus arched a brow. So, your instincts told you that my client, a woman simply standing outside a store, was a threat? Miller's mouth pressed into a thin line. I didn't say that. But you thought she was up to no good. Marcus took another step forward, forcing Miller's eyes back to his. Without her doing anything, without her breaking any laws, without even speaking to her. Miller bristled. Listen, kid. Objection. Mills stood abruptly, badgering the witness. Marcus didn't even turn his head, withdrawn. He stepped back, pausing just enough to let the tension settle before speaking again, this time lowering his voice just slightly, making the entire courtroom lean in. Mr. Miller, you've lived in that neighborhood for how long? Miller exhaled sharply, still clearly annoyed. 46 years. And in those 46 years, how many times have you reported a white person for standing outside a business? Silence. Miller's jaw tensed further, his shoulders stiff. Once, twice, Marcus pressed, maybe 10 times, or is it none at all? The room was so quiet that the scratch of a pen from the court clerk sounded deafening. Miller didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way his gaze dropped slightly, the way his fingers curled into fists on his lap, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed. He didn't have an answer that would save him. Marcus let the silence linger, turning just slightly to glance at the jury. He wanted them to see what he saw, the doubt, the discomfort, the way the weight of Miller's words was finally catching up to him. Then, with the same calm, precise tone, he turned back. "Mr. Miller, can you say with absolute certainty that if my client were a white woman in a business suit standing outside that same store, you would have had the same reaction?" Miller's lips parted, but nothing came out. Marcus waited. Miller exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "I don't know." "You don't know." Marcus repeated the words slowly, deliberately. "But you called the police anyway." Miller's gaze flickered toward Wilkins now, something unreadable crossing his face. Wilkins, who had been sitting so confidently before, now had a clenched jaw, his fingers twitching slightly against the table. He was trying to suppress it, but Marcus saw it. Fear. Not of Danielle, not of Marcus, but of something slipping. Marcus nodded, taking a step back. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Lawson let out a slow breath before glancing toward Mills. "Redirect?" Mills hesitated. He was already calculating, already weighing whether trying to salvage Miller's testimony was worth it. Finally, with a slow shake of his head, he sighed, "No, Your Honor." "All right," the judge said, glancing at Miller. "The witness may step down." Miller climbed down stiffly, moving slower than before, his once certain expression now grim. He avoided looking at the jury, at Marcus, even at Wilkins as he made his way back to his seat. The prosecution had expected his testimony to strengthen their case. Instead, it had left a crack. Wilkins' smirk had vanished. Marcus sat down, his heart pounding in his chest, but his expression remained steady. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was something, and from the way Wilkins' fingers twitched against the table, the officer knew it too. Danielle rose from her seat with the same deliberate control she had mastered years ago, her movements precise, measured. She adjusted her blazer as she approached the witness stand, her shoulders squared, her gaze unwavering. The courtroom watched as she took her seat, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her, but she remained still, composed. The bailiff swore her in, and as she placed her hand on the Bible, she could feel the tension in the air tightening, thick like a brewing storm. Marcus approached, his voice steady but firm. "Miss Carter, I want you to tell the court in your own words what happened the night of your arrest." Danielle inhaled slowly, her voice calm but carrying across the room with precision. "I was on my way home from visiting a friend when I stopped outside the hardware store to check my phone for directions. That's when Officer Wilkins approached me. He didn't greet me, didn't ask if I needed assistance. The first thing he said was, 'What are you doing here?' And he shined his flashlight directly in my face." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Danielle didn't falter. Her tone remained steady, but there was an undeniable weight behind her words, a quiet force that demanded attention. "I asked why he was questioning me, and he told me I looked suspicious," she continued. "When I asked what exactly made me suspicious, he told me not to be difficult and demanded my ID. I knew my rights. I wasn't trespassing, I wasn't loitering, I wasn't causing a disturbance. I asked if I had done anything illegal, and instead of answering, he grabbed my arm." The murmurs grew louder now, the tension in the room shifting. In the back, a woman shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Even some of the jurors looked uncertain now, their earlier conviction fading. Marcus nodded, stepping closer. "Did you resist?" Danielle's jaw tightened slightly, but she shook her head. "No. I pulled my arm back and told him to let go of me. That's when he shoved me against the car, twisted my arm behind my back, and told me I was under arrest." Across the room, Wilkins exhaled sharply, shaking his head slightly, but he didn't speak. The prosecutor, however, took the opportunity to rise from his seat, walking with exaggerated patience as he approached the stand. Mills smirked, tilting his head as he glanced at the jury before settling his gaze on Danielle. "Miss Carter," he said smoothly, "that's quite the version of events." Danielle's expression didn't change. It's not a version. It's the truth. Mills chuckled under his breath, turning slightly as if addressing the entire courtroom. So, let me get this straight. A decorated police officer, a man with over 15 years on the force, fabricated an entire story just to arrest you? That's what you're asking this jury to believe? Danielle didn't blink. Yes. The room stilled. Mills opened his mouth, but for a brief second nothing came out. Then, with a scoff, he straightened. I see, he muttered. Well, Miss Carter, you'll forgive me if I don't take your word at face value. Danielle's lips twitched slightly, but she held back the smile. You don't have to, she said evenly. The truth will come out soon enough. Marcus took a steady breath, his fingers gripping the USB drive as if it held the weight of the entire trial. The room was already thick with tension, the air barely moving, as if the entire courtroom was waiting for the next strike in an invisible war. He stepped forward, his voice measured but firm. Your Honor, the defense would like to present new evidence, video footage taken by a bystander during Miss Carter's arrest. Judge Lawson frowned, his gaze flickering toward the prosecutor. Mills immediately stood, straightening his tie with exaggerated patience. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense should have submitted all evidence prior to this moment. Introducing new material now is nothing more than a desperate attempt to— Save it, Counselor, Judge Lawson interrupted, his voice carrying the slightest edge of irritation. He turned his sharp gaze toward Marcus. Why wasn't this submitted earlier? Marcus didn't flinch. Because, Your Honor, the footage was only recently obtained, and I believe once you see it you'll understand why Officer Wilkins' body camera conveniently malfunctioned that night. The room stirred. Even some jurors leaned in slightly, curiosity flickering across their faces. The tension had shifted, the carefully constructed foundation of Wilkins' testimony suddenly feeling less stable. The judge exhaled through his nose before nodding toward the bailiff. Let's see it. A projector screen descended from the ceiling as the courtroom's lights dimmed slightly. The bailiff inserted the USB drive into the system, and after a brief moment the screen flickered to life. The video was shaky, clearly recorded from a phone, the angle slightly obstructed by a car door. But the audio, clear as day, filled the courtroom like a slow, creeping storm. Wilkins' voice rang out first. What are you doing here? Danielle's response followed, even unthreatening. Checking my phone. Let me see your ID. Did I do something wrong? The murmurs in the courtroom started almost instantly. The jury watched intently, their earlier skepticism beginning to shift as the video played out. Then, on screen, Wilkins moved in closer, his flashlight pointed directly at Danielle's face. You look like trouble, he muttered, his voice lower now, but not low enough to escape the recording. More murmurs. Someone in the gallery sucked in a sharp breath. The footage showed Danielle standing perfectly still, her hands relaxed at her sides. There was no aggression, no hostility, just a woman asking why she was being stopped. Then, without warning, Wilkins grabbed her arm. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. On screen, Danielle's voice remained calm. Let go of me. Wilkins yanked harder, then shoved her against the hood of the patrol car with such force that even the shaky camera captured the way her body lurched. And then, the words that would haunt the courtroom forever. Women like you don't get to question me. The silence that followed was deafening. In the back row, one of Wilkins' fellow officers shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman in the front clamped a hand over her mouth. A juror, who had previously seemed indifferent, blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what they had just heard. Wilkins's pale complexion had turned ghostly. He gripped the table, his fingers digging into the wood, his once confident smirk completely erased. Marcus let the video continue. The footage showed Wilkins pressing Danielle harder against the car, cuffing her while she barely moved, while she never fought back. The clip ended with the distant voice of the bystander whispering, "This is messed up," before the screen went black. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the whispers erupted. Judge Lawson slammed his gavel down. "Order! I will have order in this court." It took several seconds for the murmurs to die down, but the energy had changed. There was no going back now. The evidence was undeniable. The jury had seen it, the press had seen it, and most importantly, Wilkins knew he had just lost control of the narrative. Mills stood abruptly, his face tight. "Your Honor, this video—" "Save it," Judge Lawson cut him off, his voice uncharacteristically sharp. His gaze flicked toward Wilkins, who was now visibly sweating. "Sergeant Wilkins, you have anything to say about this?" Wilkins' mouth opened, but no words came out. The once confident officer, the man who had spun a perfectly believable story just hours ago, was now drowning in his own silence. Danielle remained still, her face unreadable, but her eyes never left Wilkins. She had fought battles before, she had survived worse, and now she was watching a different kind of war play out, one where the truth was finally, irrevocably, crashing through the lies. Marcus turned to the jury, his voice steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard Officer Wilkins' account. Now, you've seen the truth." The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. The courtroom had become something else entirely, no longer a place where Wilkins controlled the narrative, but a battlefield where he was losing, piece by piece. And for the first time since this trial had begun, he knew it. Mills exhaled sharply, forcing a smirk as he straightened his tie and approached the witness stand. The video had rattled him, there was no denying that, but he wasn't about to let control slip so easily. His confidence wasn't shaken yet. He had been in this game long enough to know that jurors needed permission to doubt the evidence, to explain it away, to believe the story that made them feel most comfortable, and that's exactly what he intended to give them. He stopped just a few feet from Danielle, tilting his head as he examined her with feigned curiosity. "Miss Carter," he drawled, letting the words stretch, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you certainly tell a compelling story. But that's all it is, isn't it? A story?" Danielle didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't so much as blink. She let the question hang in the air, let the weight of it settle over the courtroom like thick smoke. Mills took her silence as an opportunity to continue, pacing slightly as he gestured toward the jury. "What we have here, ladies and gentlemen, is a classic case of perception versus reality. We have an officer, Sergeant Wilkins, who has spent over 15 years serving this community, putting his life on the line to keep you safe. And then we have Miss Carter, a woman who, according to her, was simply checking her phone when all of this unfolded. But let's be real, how many people truly believe that an officer, a decorated member of law enforcement, would just decide to arrest someone for no reason at all?" He paused, letting his words settle in, scanning the jury for even the smallest hint of agreement. Some of them shifted slightly, and Mills seized it immediately. "Miss Carter, you expect us to believe that this officer, a man with commendations, a man with a proven record, fabricated an entire story out of thin air, that he felt so threatened by you, a woman standing outside a store, that he concocted this entire situation?" He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "Forgive me if I don't take your word at face value." The smirk on Mills' face widened, but then something happened. Danielle moved. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted in her seat before rising to her feet, her presence suddenly commanding, forcing every eye in the room onto her. The tension in the courtroom changed instantly. She straightened her blazer, her expression unreadable but undeniably powerful. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, controlled, yet every syllable cut through the room like steel. "You don't have to take my word at face value, counselor," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "Because I'm not just any woman standing outside a store." The room was silent, the energy shifting into something electric. Mills' smirk faltered slightly. "Oh?" Danielle took a slow step forward, placing her hands lightly on the edge of the witness stand. "I am Lieutenant Commander Danielle Carter, retired Navy SEAL." The words dropped like a bomb. The courtroom, for the first time since the trial had begun, was absolutely, utterly still. No whispers, no murmurs, just the sharp intake of breath from multiple people all at once. A juror's eyes widened, her mouth slightly open. A reporter in the back nearly dropped his pen. Even the judge's usually neutral expression flickered with something unreadable. Mills took a step back, blinking. Wilkins, from across the room, stiffened so suddenly that the subtle tremor in his fingers was now impossible to ignore. Danielle's gaze never wavered. For 18 years, I served my country. I led operations in places most people in this room wouldn't dare set foot in. I have been trained in combat, intelligence, and threat assessment. And if I had been a threat that night, Officer Wilkins would not have walked away unscathed. Mills swallowed, clearly thrown, but trying to recover. I am not just some woman standing outside a store, Danielle continued, her voice unwavering, her presence filling every inch of the space. I am a decorated officer, just like Sergeant Wilkins claims to be. The difference? I have spent my life upholding a code of honor that doesn't allow for abuse of power. I have spent my life defending people who couldn't defend themselves, and I will not stand here and let a man like him twist the truth to cover up his own action. The energy in the room shifted again. Some jurors who had been neutral now looked visibly shaken. Others stared at Wilkins, measuring him against the woman standing before them, a woman who radiated strength in a way that could not be fabricated. Wilkins looked sick. Judge Lawson exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair as if needing a moment to process what had just unfolded. Mills hesitated, then forced a chuckle, but it lacked its earlier bravado. Well, that's impressive, Miss Carter, truly, but let's not pretend that military training makes you immune to breaking the law. Danielle arched a brow. And let's not pretend that a badge makes a man incapable of lying. Mills opened his mouth to respond, but the impact had already been made. Danielle had just flipped the entire trial on its head. The silence stretched across the courtroom, thick and suffocating. Danielle's words still hung in the air, ringing through the minds of every person in the room like a gunshot in the dead of night. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the soft hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade into nothingness. Mills's mouth hung open slightly, his usually sharp mind scrambling for a way to regain control. His grip on the case had been strong, unshakable, until now. The smug certainty that had carried him through this trial had been shattered in an instant. He had built his case on the assumption that Danielle Carter was just another civilian, another ordinary defendant who could be painted as hostile, uncooperative, a threat. But this was different. Across the room, Wilkins sat frozen, his complexion drained of color, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned bone white. His confidence, his smirks, his arrogance, it had all vanished. If he had looked like he was in control before, now he looked like a man on the edge of a precipice, staring down into a void he had never anticipated. Judge Lawson, who had remained unreadable throughout most of the trial, shifted forward in his chair. His normally weary gaze was now sharp, piercing, as he studied Danielle with newfound intensity. A gasp broke the silence, then another. Somewhere in the jury box, a woman wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what had just been revealed. In the back of the room, the row of uniformed officers who had been quietly supporting Wilkins exchanged glances, unease flickering between them. The shift was almost imperceptible, but it was there. A crack in their solidarity, a hesitation where there had once been certainty. Danielle held her ground, her presence commanding. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in the stunned silence. She simply existed in the truth of who she was, and that was enough to change the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. For 18 years, she continued, her voice smooth as steel, I protected this country. I led missions in places Wilkins wouldn't last a day. I have been trained in combat, intelligence, de-escalation, and threat assessment. And let me be clear, if I had been a threat that night, if I had truly wanted to harm Officer Wilkins, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Her words hit like a hammer. Wilkins' fingers twitched on the table, his mouth opening as if to interject, but no words came out. Mills straightened, trying to salvage what little ground he had left. That's, he began, forcing a smirk. A very impressive resume, Miss Carter, but let's not pretend that serving in the military makes you above the law. Danielle turned her gaze toward him, and for the first time he hesitated. Her presence wasn't just commanding, it was overwhelming. And let's not pretend that wearing a badge makes a man incapable of abusing his power. The murmur that followed was immediate, spreading through the courtroom like wildfire. Mills clenched his jaw, glancing at the jury, sensing the unraveling. "You say you're a Navy SEAL." "I don't say," Danielle cut in, her voice like a blade. "I am. Lieutenant Commander, retired. My service record is verifiable. Would you like me to provide my commendations?" The prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line. He had walked into a trap, and he knew it. Danielle took a slow step back, allowing the moment to breathe before she spoke again. "I have operated in combat zones, where life and death decisions are made in seconds. I have been responsible for the safety of my team, for civilians, for those who cannot protect themselves. And do you know what that means, counselor? It means I know what a real threat looks like, and I was not a threat that night." The jury was transfixed. The doubt that Mills had worked so hard to plant was crumbling beneath their feet, replaced by something far more dangerous for the prosecution: belief. Danielle turned her head slightly, looking toward the jury, addressing them now. "Let me ask you, do I look like someone who needs to steal a weapon to defend herself?" More murmurs. Someone in the back chuckled under their breath. The tension in the room cracked just slightly as the absurdity of Wilkins' claims became undeniable. Marcus took a step forward. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice measured, "what do you believe truly happened that night?" Danielle's eyes flicked toward Wilkins, and this time it was he who flinched. "I believe Officer Wilkins saw a black woman standing in a place he didn't think she belonged," she said plainly. "I believe he approached me with the assumption that I was guilty of something even if he didn't know what, and when I questioned his authority, when I didn't immediately submit, he saw that as a challenge. And men like him," she let her words sink in, "don't like being questioned." Wilkins exhaled sharply, shaking his head, but he still said nothing. Mills straightened his shoulders, trying to pivot. "Are you saying Officer Wilkins is racist?" Danielle tilted her head as if considering. "I'm saying Officer Wilkins saw what he wanted to see. And that is exactly why he shouldn't have the power that he does." Judge Lawson inhaled deeply, pressing his fingers together before finally speaking. "Ms. Carter," he said slowly, "are you saying there is additional evidence the court has yet to see?" Danielle didn't look at Marcus. Didn't hesitate. "Yes." Mills stiffened. Wilkins swallowed hard. The judge turned his gaze toward Marcus. "Mr. Evans, does the defense intend to present this evidence?" Marcus's confidence had never been higher. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Lawson nodded, sitting back in his chair. "Then court will reconvene tomorrow morning." He slammed his gavel down. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scrambled for their phones, murmurs filled the air, and even the jurors were whispering among themselves. Wilkins shoved back his chair and stormed toward his lawyer, his movements tense, his mouth twisted in something dangerously close to panic. Danielle didn't move. She just turned, catching Marcus's eye as she returned to her seat. He leaned in. "What do you have?" he whispered. Danielle folded her hands in her lap, her expression unreadable. "The truth." Marcus exhaled, nodding slowly. "Good." Wilkins was unraveling, and they both knew it. And tomorrow, he wouldn't just be caught in a lie, he would be exposed. The next morning, the courtroom was even more packed than before. The energy had shifted. There was no denying that something monumental was about to unfold. The whispers had turned into a low buzz, speculation hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. The jury members filed in, their expressions more serious, their minds already processing what had been revealed the day before. Wilkins sat stiffly at the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles had turned white. His lawyer, sitting beside him, whispered something urgently, but Wilkins barely reacted. His usually smug expression had been replaced with something colder, something harder, something closer to fear. Marcus stood with purpose, the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but this time he welcomed it. He approached the judge's bench, his movements controlled, methodical, as he lifted a thick folder from his briefcase and held it up for the court to see. "Your Honor," he began, his voice strong and unwavering, The defense would like to submit into evidence Officer Wilkins' personnel file, which details a concerning pattern of misconduct throughout his career. Mills was on his feet in an instant. Objection irrelevant. Judge Lawson barely spared him a glance. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Evans. Marcus turned toward the jury, his expression unreadable, his grip tightening slightly on the folder. The prosecution has painted Officer Wilkins as a dedicated public servant, a man who has spent 15 years protecting this community. But what they failed to mention is that this is not the first time Officer Wilkins has been accused of excessive force. This is not the first time he has been accused of racial profiling, and this is not the first time his body camera has conveniently malfunctioned during a questionable arrest. A shift rippled through the room, jurors sitting up straighter, members of the gallery murmuring. Even Judge Lawson leaned forward slightly. Marcus opened the file, flipping to the first page. Let's start with 2017. A black teenager, unarmed, was stopped by Officer Wilkins outside a gas station. The reason? He looked suspicious. The boy was handcuffed, pushed to the ground, and detained for over 30 minutes before being released without charge. When the parents requested body cam footage, they were told the camera had, what was the phrase? Malfunctioned? He moved to the next page. 2019.A, a Hispanic man was pulled over for a broken taillight. Officer Wilkins arrested him on charges of resisting arrest. When questioned about excessive force, Wilkins claimed the suspect had been aggressive. The charges were later dropped due to lack of evidence, but the man, who suffered a broken wrist during the arrest, filed a complaint. The result? No disciplinary action. Wilkins shifted in his seat, jaw clenched so tightly that his entire body seemed rigid. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering something urgently, but Wilkins barely moved. Marcus continued, flipping another page, and now here we are. 2023, another black person stopped without probable cause, another unnecessary escalation, another conveniently malfunctioning body camera. Are we starting to see a pattern here? The jury was no longer just listening. They were absorbing every word. A woman in the front row narrowed her eyes, arms crossed, shaking her head slightly. One of the older jurors, a white man who had previously seemed indifferent, now rubbed his chin, his expression deeply contemplative. Mills forced himself to stand, his face tight. Your Honor, this is nothing more than an attempt to smear Officer Wilkins' character. Marcus didn't even look at him. His record speaks for itself. Judge Lawson glanced at Wilkins, who was now visibly sweating. I'll allow it. Proceed. Marcus nodded, flipping to the final page of the file. But this is my favorite one, he said, his voice laced with something sharp, because in 2021, Officer Wilkins was reprimanded not once, not twice, but 3 times for failing to turn on his body camera during use of force incidents. 3 separate occasions where there was no footage to verify his version of events. Wilkins' fingers twitched. Marcus let the words settle, watching as the weight of them pressed down on the jury. This is not a man who made one mistake. This is a man who has a history of abusing his power. A man who has been protected by the system over and over again, but today he is being held accountable. For the first time since the trial began, Wilkins didn't look like a man in control. He looked like a man caught. Wilkins shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table as though holding onto it for stability. The once confident posture, the smug glances, the relaxed arrogance, gone. His breathing had grown shallow, his eyes darting toward the jury, scanning their faces for anything that resembled support. He found none. Marcus let the silence stretch, watching him, waiting. The pressure was mounting, and everyone in the room could feel it. The jurors, the judge, even Mills, who was gripping his pen so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Wilkins licked his lips, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. When he finally spoke, his voice was nowhere near the controlled authority it had been before. This is taken out of context, he started, his words stumbling over each other. I did my job. I always do my job. Marcus tilted his head slightly, feigning curiosity. Did your job? Is that what you call what we saw in that video, Sergeant? Wilkins exhaled sharply, shaking his head. She wasn't cooperating. Marcus didn't blink. You mean the way she stood still? The way she asked why she was being detained? That kind of not cooperating? Wilkins shifted again, his knee bouncing slightly beneath the table. She was aggressive, he insisted, voice strained now, cracking under the weight of the evidence against him. You can't hear everything on the video. She was getting hostile. Marcus turned toward the jury, his eyebrows raising slightly. Hostile. That's an interesting word. Tell me, Sergeant, at what point does a woman calmly asking why she's being detained become a threat? Wilkins opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He looked toward Mills, but even the prosecutor remained frozen, staring straight ahead, realizing there was nothing left to salvage. Marcus stepped closer to the witness stand. I'll ask again, Sergeant, at what point does a woman standing still become a threat? Wilkins' breathing had grown heavier now, his collar damp with sweat. He gritted his teeth, shaking his head. That's not what happened. You weren't there. You don't know. Marcus cut him off, voice razor sharp. We don't need to be there, Sergeant. We saw the video. We saw you grab Ms. Carter. We saw you shove her against the car, and we all heard exactly what you said to her. Wilkins' lips parted, his jaw working, but nothing came out. Marcus took a step back, letting his words settle. Tell me, Sergeant, he said, his voice softer now, deadlier. Was your body camera malfunctioning all those other times because you didn't want people to hear what you said to them too? The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the entire room. Wilkins' shoulders had begun to tremble ever so slightly, his grip on the table desperate. He was drowning, and everyone in the courtroom could see it. Marcus turned toward the judge. No further questions, Your Honor. Judge Lawson let out a slow breath, then turned toward Wilkins. Sergeant Wilkins, you may step down. Wilkins hesitated, gripping the armrest of his chair as though getting up would somehow make it worse. Then, slowly, he rose, every movement stiff, mechanical. He walked back to his seat, eyes locked on the table in front of him, avoiding the jury, avoiding Danielle, avoiding everything. Danielle watched him, unreadable, her face betraying nothing, but she knew. She had seen this before, not in a courtroom, but on a battlefield. Wilkins wasn't just losing. He was already lost. Danielle stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blazer with deliberate calm, stepping away from the witness stand and turning to face the jury. The weight of the moment pressed against her, but she had been trained to carry heavier burdens. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, letting her words settle in her mind before she spoke. When she finally did, her voice was unwavering, controlled, yet charged with the kind of raw power that could not be ignored. This isn't just about me, she began, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the jurors, her tone steady but filled with unshakable conviction. This is about every black woman who has ever been stopped for no reason other than existing in a space someone else decided wasn't meant for her. It's about every woman who was told to keep her head down, to comply, to not make trouble, because speaking up would only make things worse. The jury was silent, locked on to her. This is about every time someone like me was called aggressive instead of assertive. Every time we were told we were being difficult when all we did was ask why. Every time someone in power made up their mind about who we were before we ever opened our mouths. She let the words settle, let the courtroom feel the weight of them. I have spent my life serving this country, she continued, voice growing stronger, rising not in anger but in certainty. I have been to war, I have led men into battle, I have made life or meth decisions under the most extreme conditions imaginable. I have earned respect on the battlefield, but in my own country I was treated like a criminal for standing still. A murmur rippled through the gallery. One of the jurors, a middle-aged white woman, shifted uncomfortably, her fingers gripping the armrest of her chair. Another, a young black man, exhaled softly, his expression unreadable but deeply attentive. Danielle took another step forward, her voice carrying through the room with sharp precision. I was not a threat that night. I did not reach for his gun. I did not attack him. What I did was question why I was being treated like I didn't belong in my own city, and that was enough for him to see me as a problem that needed to be handled. Her gaze swept toward Wilkins, who now sat stiffly in his chair, refusing to meet her eyes. She let her stare linger on him, not in triumph, not in anger, but in something deeper, something he would never understand. "The truth is, I was never supposed to fight back," she said, turning back toward the jury. "I was supposed to sit here, quiet, afraid, accepting whatever version of the story they told you. But today I get to speak, and you will listen." The silence was deafening. She could see it now, the shift. Some of them had already made up their minds, but for others, this was the moment everything changed. She softened her voice just slightly, letting the raw honesty bleed through. "There are people like Wilkins everywhere. Men who believe their power makes them untouchable, who count on the fact that no one will question them because they wear a badge, and for too long they've been right. For too long the people they silence never get the chance to be heard. But not today." Her breath was steady, her hands at her sides. She had said what she needed to say. Now the truth no longer belonged to her alone. It was out there, in the hands of the jury, in the minds of every person in that room. She took one last look around, then turned back toward Marcus and walked to her seat, her posture as unshaken as it had been when she first stepped into the courtroom. Marcus exhaled, nodding at her as she sat. Across the room, Mills looked tense, his fingers twitching as he shuffled his papers, his previous confidence nowhere to be found. And Wilkins looked like a man who knew the battle had already been lost. The courtroom was thick with anticipation, the air so tense it felt almost suffocating. Every breath, every subtle movement, every shifting glance carried weight. The jury had been deliberating for hours, long enough for doubt, fear, and the weight of responsibility to settle over them like an inescapable fog. Now, as the bailiff announced their return, the room fell into a heavy silence. Danielle sat still, hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She had seen battles like this before, not with guns and armor, but with words and power. And like all battles, she knew the hardest part was the waiting. The judge took his seat, his face unreadable, then turned to the jury box. "Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" A woman in her late 50s, her face lined with the weight of the decision, stood, a single sheet of paper clutched in her hands. She cleared her throat, glancing down before speaking. "Yes, Your Honor, we have..." A pause. "In the case of the State versus Danielle Carter on the charge of resisting arrest, we find the defendant..." A breathless moment. "Not guilty." A ripple of reaction swept through the room. A few gasps, a hushed murmur. Danielle remained still, her fingers pressing lightly against each other, but Marcus released a slow, shaky breath. The foreperson continued. "On the charge of assaulting a police officer, we find the defendant not guilty." This time the reaction was louder. The murmurs grew, journalists scribbled furiously, and from the gallery someone whispered, "Damn right." The judge banged his gavel once, but even he didn't seem surprised. Across the room, Mills's shoulder sank slightly, his jaw tight. He looked toward Wilkins, whose face had gone completely white. The foreperson straightened, glancing briefly at Danielle before reading the last statement. "Furthermore, we, the jury, strongly recommend an internal investigation into the conduct of Officer Ryan Wilkins." If the courtroom had been tense before, now it was an earthquake. Wilkins's mouth opened slightly, a breath of disbelief escaping him as his body jerked forward in his chair. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Wilkins barely seemed to hear. He was still staring straight ahead, unblinking, as if his brain couldn't process what had just happened. Marcus turned to Danielle, and for the first time in the entire trial, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Judge Lawson exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose before turning to the jury. "The court acknowledges the jury's recommendation. This matter will be referred for further review." His gaze shifted toward Wilkins, his tone carrying something unspoken but unmistakable. "Officer Wilkins, I suggest you prepare accordingly." Wilkins was breathing hard now, his fingers twitching against the table. His entire body was locked in place, muscles tight with barely concealed rage and humiliation. This was not how it was supposed to go. Danielle stood first. She didn't gloat, didn't turn to look at him. She simply adjusted her blazer, squared her shoulders, and took the first step toward the exit. The moment she moved, the courtroom seemed to shift around her. The whispers followed her, hushed but reverent, Some people nodded as she passed, others stared, their expressions unreadable but changed. She had been on trial when she walked into this room. Now, she was something else entirely. Wilkins, on the other hand, stood much slower, almost staggering as he rose from his seat. His entire world had tilted on its axis, and there was no way to set it right again. As he turned to leave, he caught sight of the other officers in the back row. The support that had once been there was fading. Some of them looked away. Others wore unreadable expressions. A few, for the first time, looked ashamed. He swallowed hard, his breath uneven. His career, his entire identity had been built on the idea that people like him never had to answer for anything. Now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. Danielle reached the doors first, the fresh air just on the other side. Without hesitation, she stepped through, walking forward with her head held high. Wilkins followed moments later, but the weight on his shoulders was crushing, and for the first time in his life, there was no one there to lift it for him. Months passed, but the echoes of the trial never faded. The verdict had been delivered, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The city of Atlanta buzzed with conversations that refused to die down. News outlets ran feature after feature dissecting the case. Op-eds flooded newspapers, and social media erupted into debates that grew more intense with every passing day. The footage of Wilkins slamming Danielle against the car, his venomous words, "Women like you don't get to question me," had taken on a life of its own. It spread across every platform, shared millions of times, forcing even those who had long ignored conversations about racial profiling and police brutality to finally look. For Wilkins, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. 2 weeks after the trial, the Atlanta Police Department announced that he had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. The review of his past cases, including those Marcus had exposed in court, revealed a pattern of misconduct too blatant to ignore. Complaints that had once been dismissed or quietly buried were now being revisited. Witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak out came forward. Then came the breaking point. A leaked internal memo revealed that Wilkins' body camera malfunctions had occurred in over a dozen separate incidents, always under circumstances where excessive force had been alleged. The department, facing mounting public outrage, had no choice but to act. Wilkins was officially terminated from the force. But it didn't stop there. With the new evidence, the district attorney's office launched an investigation into whether Wilkins had committed perjury during Danielle's trial. He had sworn under oath that his camera had failed, that he had felt threatened, that Danielle had reached for his weapon, all now provable lies. A month later, he was formally charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. The once untouchable officer, who had strutted into the courtroom certain of his victory, now faced the very system he had used against others. His former colleagues distanced themselves, and the blue wall of silence that had once protected him had crumbled. Danielle, on the other hand, had found her voice amplified beyond anything she had ever imagined. What had started as one woman defending herself in a courtroom had become something much bigger. Her story had gone viral, turning her into an unintentional symbol of resistance and accountability. Interview requests poured in from major networks, CNN, MSNBC, even international news outlets. The footage from the trial, particularly her unwavering statement, "Today I get to speak, and you will listen," was played over and over again, a rallying cry for those who had felt silenced for too long. She hadn't planned on becoming an activist, but as she stood in front of crowds, speaking at forums, universities, and town halls, she realized that staying silent had never been an option. She spoke not just for herself, but for every black woman who had been dismissed, every victim of racial profiling who never got the chance to fight back. She stood on stages where civil rights leaders had once stood, looking into the faces of young women who saw in her the courage they hoped to find in themselves. At one of her first public appearances after the trial, a young girl no older than 16 approached her after a speech. She had big, hopeful eyes, her hands twisting nervously in front of her. "Miss Carter," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "I want to join the military one day, but I'm scared. People like me, we don't always get treated fairly." Danielle knelt to her level, her voice strong but gentle. "The world will try to tell you who you are before you even get a chance to show them," she said. "But that doesn't mean you let them. You hold your ground, you speak your truth, and when they tell you that you don't belong, you look them in the eye and make them listen." The girl nodded, her grip tightening around the notebook she had been holding. "I will," she whispered. Danielle smiled, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Good." As the months went on, changes rippled outward. Wilkins' case became one of the most high-profile police accountability trials the city had seen in years. Protests demanding police reform gained traction. Conversations that had once been buried under bureaucracy were now happening at every level of local government. And through it all, Danielle remained steady. She was no longer just a former Navy SEAL or a woman who had been wrongfully arrested. She was a force, one that refused to be ignored, one that refused to be silenced. Her fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the world was finally paying attention. Danielle stood at the podium, the heat of the camera lights pressing against her skin, the crowd in front of her a sea of expectant faces. The steps of the courthouse behind her felt heavier now, no longer just a backdrop but a battlefield where she had fought and won. Journalists leaned forward, microphones angled toward her, pens poised above their notepads, ready to capture whatever she would say next. But the energy in the air was different. This wasn't just another press conference. This was a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered. She exhaled slowly, then raised her eyes to meet the cameras. "I spent my life defending freedom," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "I trained, fought, and bled alongside men and women who swore to protect this country. But what I learned, what this trial proved, is that some of the greatest threats to our freedom don't come from beyond our borders. They come from within." The murmurs quieted, the weight of her words sinking in. "I was taught that the uniform, the badge, the oath meant something, that they were symbols of honor, of integrity, of justice. But what happens when those who wear them forget that? When they believe their authority makes them untouchable, when they decide that people like me, people who look like me, don't deserve the same rights they swore to protect?" She glanced toward the reporters, the flashing cameras, the live streaming phones, broadcasting her every word to thousands, maybe millions. "I want to be clear," she continued. "This wasn't just about one bad cop. It never is. It's about the system that protects them. It's about the silence that allows them to thrive, and it's about the people who would rather look the other way than admit there's a problem." The wind shifted, ruffling the edges of her blazer, but Danielle remained still, unshaken. "So I'll ask you, who defends us from those who abuse power? Who holds them accountable? Because if we leave it to the system, the answer is no one." A beat of silence, a tension so thick it could be felt. "I was lucky. I had the training, the discipline, and the ability to stand up and fight back. But how many others never get that chance? How many never get to tell their side of the story? How many are buried under the weight of false charges, under the assumption that their word means less than a badge?" She took a step back, letting her final words settle over the crowd like an inescapable truth. "This fight isn't over. It never was." The reporters erupted all at once. Questions were shouted, flashes exploded like tiny bursts of lightning, and the crowd buzzed with the electricity of the moment. But Danielle had said what she needed to say. She turned, walking down the courthouse steps, the voices behind her fading into the wind. And she knew without a doubt that they had heard her. "Now, I turn to you. What do you think? Do you believe the system is built to protect the innocent or the powerful? If this had been you or someone you love, what would you have done? Would you have fought? Would you have believed in the process? Or would you have walked away, knowing the odds were stacked against you? Because let's be real, this isn't just one case. This happens every day, in places big and small, to people whose names we will never know. So I ask you, how much longer are we going to pretend this isn't happening? How much longer are we going to let the weight of injustice fall on those who don't have the privilege to fight back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's make sure that when the next Danielle Carter stands up, she isn't standing alone. And if you take one thing from this story, let it be this: Never underestimate the truth. It has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. Never assume justice will come easily. If this trial proved anything, it's that the system doesn't hand out fairness. You have to fight for it, demand it, and sometimes even break it apart to rebuild it. And never, ever be silent in the face of injustice. Silence is complicity. Silence is what lets men like Wilkins operate unchecked for years. Silence is what keeps people afraid, keeps them from speaking out, from believing their voices matter. But the truth is, your voice does matter. Your voice can change minds. Your voice can challenge systems. Your voice can demand better. So if this story moved you, if you felt anger, if you felt frustration, if you felt the weight of what Danielle Carter had to endure, share it. Because the more people see it, the harder it becomes to ignore. Because justice should never be a privilege. Justice should be a right. And the more we speak, the more we fight, the more we demand, the closer we get to making that a reality. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, don't let it end here. This is more than just one case, more than just one person's fight. This is about justice. This is about truth. This is about ensuring that no one, no matter their background, their race, or their status, has to fear those who are meant to protect them. The system only changes when we demand it. The voices of those in power grow quieter when we speak louder. So let's keep this conversation going. Let's make sure stories like Danielle Carter's don't just get buried under the next news cycle. Let's make sure they are heard. Hit that like button if you believe in accountability. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if this were you or someone you love? Share this story, because the more people see it, the harder it becomes to ignore. And most importantly, subscribe for more powerful, real, and inspiring stories of courage, justice, and change. Together we are stronger. Together we demand better. Together we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected.